Jorge's life was one of routine work, home, family, a simple but cherished rhythm that brought him peace. One evening, on his way home, Jorge's world took an unexpected turn when he discovered a young girl injured on the roadside. Acting quickly, he saved her life, unaware that this act of kindness would reconnect him with a painful past. The girl's father, Martin Silva, was the very judge who wrongfully convicted Jorge 15 years ago, a conviction that shattered his future. Despite the injustice he endured, Jorge chose forgiveness over revenge, focusing on the love and happiness he found with his family. The judge, realizing his grave mistake, sought to atone for his actions, leading to a profound and unexpected reconciliation between the two men. In the end, Jorge's kindness and resilience not only earned him a fresh start, but also inspired a change in the very man who had once destroyed his life. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Jorge lived by a rhythm that had become second nature to him: home, work, and back to home again. After a grueling day spent amidst the harsh, mechanical world of the chemical plant, his heart longed for the warm embrace of his familiar, cozy sanctuary. The drive back was a cherished ritual, even as the shadows of evening cloaked the world in darkness. It was during these quiet moments, with the hum of the engine as his only companion, that he allowed his mind to drift away from the toil and stress of the day. His thoughts would wander to the simple, yet profound joys that awaited him at home: his beloved wife, whose smile could light up even his darkest days, the comforting aroma of the meal she would have lovingly prepared, and the precious time they would share with their little boy. Huddled on the couch, losing themselves in the glow of a movie or series. Driving late into the evening never bothered Jorge. The night, with its stillness and mystery, brought a sense of calm to his soul. He had always been a cautious driver, his eyes constantly scanning the road and its periphery, fully aware of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. The rural landscape he called home was teeming with wildlife, and he knew all too well the heartache of an accidental collision. Even a stray dog or cat, suddenly darting out from the darkness, could spell disaster. Tonight, as he navigated the familiar roads, his heart swelled with anticipation. He could almost see his wife, already home after her shift, bustling around the house, preparing dinner, and making their home even more welcoming. She always managed to finish her work much earlier than he did, allowing her time to tidy up and set the scene for their evening together. Though Jorge never hesitated to lend a hand on his days off, this evening he was content to let her take the lead. As he neared the final turn that would lead him home, Jorge instinctively eased off the accelerator. Something in the corner of his vision caught his attention: a flicker of movement on the roadside. He slowed even further, his mind racing as he hoped not to startle whatever creature might be lurking in the growing darkness. But as his headlights swept over the scene, his heart froze. Reflexively, he slammed on the brakes, his eyes straining to make sense of what he was seeing. For a moment, he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him, but then he saw it: a small, delicate hand, barely visible in the dim light, smeared with blood and dust, feebly reaching out from the shadows. In an instant, Jorge was out of the car, his heart pounding in his chest as he rushed toward the figure he had mistaken for an animal. But with each hurried step, the horrifying truth became clearer. What lay before him was not a creature of the wild, but a very young girl, crumpled in the dirt, her body contorted with pain and terror. His breath caught in his throat as he realized she could not have been more than 12 years old. Her eyes, wide with panic and confusion, searched for someone to save her from this nightmare. The sight tore at Jorge's soul, a dagger of fear and sorrow plunging deep into his heart. In that agonizing moment, he knew without a doubt that she had been the victim of a terrible accident, and the weight of that realization pressed down on him like a physical force, shaking him to his core. Jorge frantically scanned the surroundings, desperately searching for any sign of a crashed vehicle, but the road remained eerily empty. His initial assumption seemed more plausible with each passing second. How this young girl ended up stranded here in the dead of night was a mystery he couldn't begin to unravel, but the harrowing thought that she might have been lying there, helpless and alone, for hours gnawed at his soul. The panic surged as he fumbled for his mobile phone, only to have his heart sink when the screen went dark, its battery dead, leaving him with nothing but a useless chunk of plastic in his hand. He cursed under his breath, knowing that without the phone, he couldn't call for the help she so desperately needed. Jorge's mind raced, grappling with the gravity of the situation. Ideally, an ambulance should be the one to transport a car accident victim. Moving her could exacerbate her injuries, perhaps even causing irreparable harm. Yet, in the stillness of the late hour, with so few cars on the road, the chances of flagging down a passerby willing to help were slim to none. Who, in their right mind, would stop for a stranger's desperate plea in the thick of night? The grim reality settled over him like a suffocating blanket. With no time to lose, Jorge knelt beside the girl, his hands trembling as he gently examined her fragile body, each touch filled with dread and urgency. He spoke to her softly, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. "Hang in there, sweetheart. I'm here, and I'm going to help you. Just hang on." Please. His heart broke as he discovered several fractures and a deep, bleeding wound on her temple. The sight of her injuries, so severe and yet so helplessly beyond his full understanding, filled him with a cold, sharp fear. He knew he had to act fast, but he also knew the excruciating pain he might cause her. Jorge rushed back to his car, his movements a blur of desperate determination. He grabbed the small first aid kit he always kept on hand, along with a few planks he had been using for some recent home repairs. Returning to the girl's side, he worked with a feverish intensity, his hands surprisingly steady as he bandaged her wounds and carefully splinted her broken bones. "Forgive me," he whispered, the words thick with sorrow and regret. "This is going to hurt, but I need you to be strong. Please, just hold on." As gently as he could, Jorge lifted the girl into his arms, every muscle in his body tensing with the effort to minimize her pain. She whimpered, her small body trembling with the effort to hold back her cries. The sound tore through him, but there was no other choice. He had to get her to the hospital. Carefully, he laid her in the back seat, her delicate frame looking even smaller against the dark upholstery. Jorge climbed into the driver's seat, his heart pounding as he started the engine and sped off into the night, his mind fixed on one single goal: saving her life. The road ahead was long, and the darkness seemed to close in around him, but he drove with a fierce determination, his every thought consumed with the desperate hope that he wasn't too late. Glancing back at the fragile child lying in the back seat, her soft whimpers cutting through the tense silence, Jorge drove with a single-minded focus. The journey to the trauma unit seemed to pass in a blur, each mile dragging him deeper into a storm of worry and fear. When he finally pulled up to the emergency entrance, he wasted no time, scooping the child into his arms and bursting through the doors, his voice breaking as he called for immediate help. Within moments, a flurry of nurses and a doctor descended upon him, their faces etched with urgency. As they took the girl from his arms, Jorge felt a heavy weight lift, only to be replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. He sank into a nearby chair, his body trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. A nurse approached, her voice gentle but probing as she asked what had happened and who the child was. Still reeling from the shock, Jorge recounted how he had found her by the roadside, her identity a complete mystery to him. He explained he knew nothing of her background, where she had come from, or who her parents might be. The realization that the doctors would need answers and that the girl was now alone, surrounded by strangers, compelled him to stay. He couldn't bring himself to leave her, not when she was so vulnerable. With a weary sigh, he approached the young woman at the reception desk, asking if he could use the phone to call his wife and let her know he wouldn't be home for dinner. The minutes stretched into agonizing hours as Jorge waited, his foot tapping nervously on the cold, sterile floor. His thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind of doubt and hope, questioning whether he had done enough, whether he had gotten her to the hospital in time. Even if the doctors had told him to go, he wouldn't have budged. He simply couldn't abandon the child he had rescued. That was the kind of man he was, compassionate to a fault, always placing the needs of others above his own. What felt like an eternity later, the doors to the ward flew open, and a man and woman rushed in like a gust of wind, their faces pale and stricken with panic. Their desperation was palpable as they demanded, more than asked, to see their daughter. One of the doctors quickly connected the dots, recognizing their names and understanding that these frantic parents belonged to the little girl Jorge had brought in. As they clung to each other, the doctor informed them that a good Samaritan had found their daughter on the side of the road and brought her in for treatment. "Who was it?" the father asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and urgency. The doctor pointed toward Jorge, who was still sitting quietly in the waiting area, lost in his thoughts. Seeing the man rise and approach him, Jorge felt a wave of recognition that sent a jolt of shock through his system. As the man neared, Jorge's thoughts spiraled. How could this be? Of all the people he could have encountered tonight, it had to be him. The girl's father extended his hand, gratitude etched on his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my daughter's life." Jorge stared at the man's hand, his expression grim and conflicted. After a moment, he reluctantly shook it, the gesture heavy with unspoken words. But as their hands met, the man's face shifted from relief to confusion, and then to a tense recognition. The air between them grew thick with the weight of the past. The man, Martin Silva, froze, his eyes narrowing as he too realized who stood before him. Jorge, however, offered no words, no explanations. He simply nodded, his expression dark and unreadable, before turning to leave. He walked away without looking back, leaving the girl in the care of those who could help her now. He wanted nothing from Martin Silva, not his thanks, not his acknowledgement. As Jorge stepped into the night, the memory of 15 years ago played in his mind, a bitter reminder of how this man, a judge, had once destroyed his life. The irony of it all stung, but Jorge had no interest in revisiting old wounds. Tonight he had done what was right, and that was enough for him. The details of how his life unraveled so quickly had faded into a hazy memory over the years. But now, as Jorge walked away from the hospital, those painful memories surged back, hitting him with the force of a tidal wave. It felt as if a heavy weight had been placed on his chest, tightening with every breath. 15 years ago, he had been just like any other young man, full of dreams, ambitions, and the naive belief that the world was a fair place. As a student, he had been focused on balancing his studies with the joys of youth. He spent his days immersed in textbooks, his nights filled with laughter and camaraderie with friends. His future seemed bright, full of endless possibilities. But that all changed in a single fateful moment. One evening, on his way home, Jorge had taken a shortcut through a quiet alley. Little did he know that this innocuous decision would become the turning point of his life. The alley he walked through had just been the scene of a brutal crime, and unfortunately, Jorge was caught on a nearby gas station security camera as he passed by. The police, eager to close the case, quickly apprehended him, mistaking him for the criminal they were after. What followed was a nightmare. The trial was swift and merciless, with witnesses falsely identifying Jorge as the assailant. They described the murderer in detail, even down to the clothing, a common sweatshirt worn by many students, including Jorge. No matter how desperately he pleaded his innocence, his words fell on deaf ears. The evidence, though circumstantial, was damning. His proximity to the crime scene and the unfortunate timing sealed his fate. Jorge was convicted of a crime he didn't commit and was sentenced to 10 long years in prison. The memory of that moment, the crushing realization that his life as he knew it was over, still made his stomach churn with a nauseating dread. Jorge let out a long, weary sigh. 15 years had passed since that dark chapter in his life, and there was no use in holding on to the anger. The injustice he endured had left a permanent scar, but he had survived it. Through good behavior, he managed to reduce his sentence and was released earlier than expected. Yet the stigma of his conviction followed him like a shadow. Finding a job was a near impossible task, and the dreams he once held dear now seemed like distant, unreachable stars. But Jorge was not one to give up. Despite the overwhelming odds, he pushed forward, determined to rebuild his life. By a twist of fate, he found work at a chemical plant in the suburbs. It was there, amidst the hum of machinery and the routine of daily labor, that he found a glimmer of hope. He met Algra, a woman who would become not only his wife but his guiding light. Algra had known him as a teenager before the world had turned its back on him. She saw past his conviction, past the mistakes of a flawed justice system, and recognized the man he truly was: kind, compassionate, and inherently good. Their love story was one of healing and redemption. Algra's unwavering support and acceptance breathed new life into Jorge's broken spirit. She didn't shy away from his past. Instead, she embraced it, understanding that it was part of who he was. Her trust in him was a balm to his wounded soul, and together they forged a bond that was both strong and tender. Their wedding was modest, but it was filled with genuine joy and love. A year later, their happiness expanded with the birth of their son, Cesar. Jorge often marveled at his good fortune. Despite everything he had been through, life had granted him a second chance, a family that brought him immeasurable joy and a sense of purpose. Algra and Cesar were the anchors that kept him grounded, the light that guided him out of the darkness. He no longer dwelled on the dreams he had lost. Instead, he cherished the life he had built with the woman he loved and the son who brought so much pride and happiness into their lives. In them, Jorge found a new dream, one that was more fulfilling than anything he could have imagined all those years ago. There was nothing more a man could ask for, and for that, Jorge was deeply, profoundly grateful. As Jorge made his way home after the harrowing events of the night, a heavy silence settled over him. The weight of what had transpired bore down on him, making it difficult to know what he could say to Algra. In all their years together, this was the first time he felt a deep reluctance to share something with her. The home he returned to was filled with warmth and love, his family welcoming him with open arms. Yet the exhaustion that clung to him was more than physical. It was a soul-deep weariness that dulled even his hunger. Sensing his need for rest, Algra didn't press him for details, gently guiding him to bed without a word. Jorge didn't resist. He was too drained to do anything but surrender to sleep. As he lay there, he resolved not to waste a single moment dwelling on the man who had once destroyed his life. The judge, Martin Silva, was not worth his thoughts or his worry. What mattered now was Algra and Cesar, the family that filled his life with meaning and joy. They were the only ones deserving of his attention and love. But while Jorge tried to let go, Martin Silva was gripped by a growing sense of dread. The judge, who had once wielded the power to shatter lives with the stroke of a pen, now found himself consumed by fear for his own life and the lives of his family. He knew the gravity of what had occurred, the danger that had suddenly become all too real. Jorge had not only seen his daughter but also knew where she lived. Silva was convinced that the former inmate would seek revenge, a dark retribution for the years of unjust suffering he had endured. For the first time in his life, Silva felt genuine terror. The image of his daughter and wife flashed before his eyes, and the thought of them being harmed because of his actions twisted his stomach in knots. The judge's mind raced as he considered how to neutralize the threat Jorge posed. Over the years, Silva had built a network of criminals who owed him favors, men whose lives he had influenced, who were indebted to him for his leniency or the strings he had pulled. He also had deep connections within law enforcement, a web of influence that he had carefully spun over his career. Action had to be swift and decisive. Silva could not allow Jorge chance to exact his revenge. The judge picked up the phone and began making calls to those with ties to the underworld. He knew these men could handle the problem in a way that would leave no trace. They could frighten Jorge into leaving town, or if necessary, they could ensure that he disappeared altogether, just another missing person, another unsolved case buried under bureaucratic red tape. With Silva's influence, it would be all too easy to ensure that any investigation into Jorge's disappearance would be half-hearted at best, never leading back to him. As the judge mobilized his resources, he collected every bit of information he could find on Jorge. The photographs from the trial 15 years ago, the evidence that had once condemned him, were still readily available. Silva's debtors listened to his instructions, their faces impassive as they agreed to take care of the situation. To them, it was just another job, another unfortunate soul to be dealt with, no questions asked. Silva felt a cold comfort knowing that soon this threat would be eliminated and the shadow that had fallen over his life would be lifted. Everything was set in motion, and Silva was confident that the problem would soon be resolved in his favor. As Jorge tried to find peace in his home, unaware of the storm gathering against him, Martin Silva was already preparing to strike, determined to protect his family at any cost, even if it meant further injustice, even if it meant destroying another life. Despite the unsettling encounter with the judge who had once turned his life upside down, Jorge made a conscious decision to move forward, refusing to let the past consume him. He continued to immerse himself in his daily routine, focusing on his work, his family, and the simple pleasures of life. However, as the days passed, he began to notice something strange. Faces he had never seen before started to become eerily familiar. The same individuals appeared on his morning commute, loitered near his workplace, and even seemed to follow him on his way home. At first, Jorge tried to dismiss these sightings as mere coincidences, but the same cars trailing him on the road and the same figures lurking in the background made it increasingly difficult to ignore the gnawing suspicion that he was being watched. The uneasy feeling grew with each passing day, a heavy weight that settled in the pit of his stomach. He found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder, his mind racing with thoughts of who might be following him and why. Was it all just paranoia, a figment of his imagination fueled by the recent encounter with Martin Silva, or was someone truly shadowing his every move? Jorge tried to shake off the dread, focusing instead on the life he had built, the family he cherished, and the future he hoped to create with Algra. But reality soon shattered any illusion that his fears were unfounded. One evening, Jorge decided to take advantage of the pleasant weather and drove into the city to visit one of his favorite shops. He was in high spirits, thinking about the upcoming anniversary with his wife and the surprise he was planning for her. The thought of her smile and the warmth of their home filled him with a sense of contentment as he picked up a few essentials. However, as he exited the store and made his way to his car parked nearby, the sound of footsteps behind him disrupted his peaceful thoughts. A glance over his shoulder confirmed his worst fears. The same men he had noticed in recent days were now following him. Their expressions were grim, their intent clear in their menacing glares. Panic surged through Jorge's veins as he quickened his pace, desperately hoping that he was wrong, that this was all just a misunderstanding, and that they were merely headed in the same direction. But as their footsteps matched him, increasing in speed, Jorge knew he was in danger. Before he could react, a sharp blow struck him from behind, sending him crashing to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and before he could regain his bearings, 5 men surrounded him. They began to kick and beat him with a brutal force that seemed fueled by deep-seated hatred, as if one of them had a personal vendetta against him. Jorge tried to protect his face and head, curling into himself as best as he could, but there was little he could do against their relentless assault. The pain was overwhelming, radiating through his body with every kick and punch, and he felt the world around him blur into a haze of agony. He had no idea how long the attack lasted. Each second felt like an eternity. The only sound in his ears, the thudding of blows and the pounding of his own heart. But just when it seemed the beating would never end, a sudden flash of headlights pierced the darkness. The glare of an unfamiliar car illuminated the scene, startling the attackers. The men scattered as quickly as they had appeared, vanishing into the night like shadows, leaving Jorge bruised and bloodied on the cold asphalt. Gasping for breath, Jorge lay there, his body throbbing with pain, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The car that had frightened off his assailants slowed as it passed, the driver casting a concerned glance at the battered figure on the ground, but then sped off, leaving Jorge Owen in the quiet aftermath of violence. Every inch of him ached, but he knew he couldn't stay there. Summoning the last of his strength, Jorge pulled himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest with every movement. As he limped to his car, he couldn't shake the realization that the past he thought he had left behind was far from over. Run was the only word Jorge heard echoing in his mind as he lay on the cold asphalt. The driver of the car, which had inadvertently saved him, seemed oblivious to the men fleeing the scene or to Jorge himself, struggling on the ground. As consciousness gradually returned, Jorge felt a wave of relief that the car had scared off his attackers just in time. Had it not been for that chance interruption, the beating could have been far worse. But as he forced himself to stand, the reality of his injuries hit him like a wave. His wrist was swollen, throbbing with intense pain, blood trickled down his face, and every movement sent sharp, agonizing pains through his sides. With immense effort, Jorge made his way to his car, his legs barely supporting him as he shakily inserted the key into the ignition. His old car, a faithful companion through many of life's trials, roared to life once more. The drive to the hospital seemed endless, the minutes dragging on just as they had when he had rushed that injured girl to safety. Each second felt like an eternity, but finally he reached the trauma department. The medical staff quickly attended to him, examining the extensive injuries he had sustained during the brutal assault. When the doctor asked him what had happened, Jorge recounted the attack as honestly as he could, describing the thugs who had ambushed him. Hearing the severity of the incident, the doctor called the police to take his statement and begin an investigation into finding the culprits. Jorge, however, didn't harbor much hope. He had learned long ago not to expect justice in a world that had wronged him so deeply before. Still, he answered the officers' questions truthfully, recounting the details of the attack. But the skepticism on their faces was unmistakable. It was clear that they suspected him of being a drunk who had stumbled into trouble, or worse, someone who had started a fight and lost. Their interrogation began with a reminder of his past conviction, a stain on his record that never seemed to fade. In the end, the police left with little more than a dismissive wave, leaving Jorge alone with the doctors. He arrived home late, well past midnight. His son was already asleep, but Algra, his ever-faithful wife, was waiting for him in the dining room, worry etched into every line of her face. The moment she saw him at the door, she leaped from her chair and rushed to his side. "Holy Virgin Mary, what happened to you?" she gasped, her voice trembling as she took in the sight of his busted lips, the cut on his brow, and the heavy bruises marring his face. Corey winced as he sat down, the tightness of the bandages around his cracked ribs making every breath a challenge. "I was attacked," he managed to say, his voice strained. The doctors had done their best, but the damage was done. Though his ribs weren't broken, they were cracked, and his swollen wrist was the result of a severe bruise to the joint. The injury meant he would be unable to work for a while, forcing him to take sick leave. Algra's eyes filled with tears as she knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she gently touched his battered face. "How can such people even walk under God's eye?" she cried, her voice breaking. "Oh, my dear, how did this happen?" Jorge shook his head, unable to answer. The attack had come out of nowhere, a violent reminder that the past was never truly behind him. He looked into Algra's tear-filled eyes and saw the reflection of his pain and fear. He knew that she, too, was reliving the nightmare of his wrongful conviction, the years of hardship they had endured together. But more than anything, he saw her love and concern, and that gave him the strength to keep going. "I don't know," he finally whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of sorrow and exhaustion. "But I'm here now, and that's all that matters." He reached out with his good hand, taking hers in his, feeling the warmth of her touch. At that moment, he knew that as long as he had Algra by his side, he could face whatever trials lay ahead. The physical pain would heal in time, but the emotional scars of the past, those were the wounds he wasn't sure would ever truly fade. But for now, he focused on the present, on the love and support of his wife, and on the life they had built together, one day at a time. Jorge listened in silence as Algra poured out her fears and frustrations, her words punctuated by fervent prayers and calls to God and all the saints she could remember. Each word was heavy with emotion, and he found himself at a loss for how to respond. When she finally calmed down, having vented her anger at the cruel world that could do such harm to an innocent man, Jorge gently took her hand and attempted a reassuring smile. "Everything will be fine, Algra," he said softly, trying to infuse his voice with confidence. "It's not as bad as the doctors made it seem." "Not as bad," Algra's voice rose again, this time with indignation. "Not as bad. Have you ever looked at yourself in the mirror?" Jorge's smile faltered as he tried to maintain his composure. "It will heal. It will," he repeated, as much to convince himself as to reassure her. The sight of tears and fear in her eyes was unbearable for him. He had spent their entire life together trying to protect her from pain and worry, and now he was the one causing her distress. "Don't worry, my dear," he murmured, stroking her hand gently. "I did file a report with the police." Algra's expression darkened as she processed his words. "The police talked to you," but she trailed off, her frown deepening as she searched his face for answers. "And do you think they'll catch those scumbags?" Jorge sighed, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "They didn't even believe me," he admitted quietly. "What? Of course they didn't believe you. You're just a convict in their eyes," Algra snapped, her anger flaring up again as she muttered curses under her breath. After a moment, she forced herself to calm down, her eyes meeting his with a new intensity. "You never told me what happened about a week ago when you stayed late after work. Could it be related to that evening?" she asked, her voice cautious. Jorge froze, his mind racing as he connected the dots. Algra's intuition was sharper than his own, it seemed. He hadn't even considered that the events of the past week might be linked, but now it seemed all too likely. The meeting with the judge nearly a week ago flashed in his mind, and with it, the realization that these two incidents were not isolated. "I don't know, darling," he replied, his voice uncertain. "But don't dwell on it. Everything will be fine." Algra sensed the turmoil in his words and decided not to press him further. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close as if her embrace could shield him from the darkness that seemed to be closing in. Gently, she helped him clean up and change into more comfortable clothes before tucking him into bed. Over the next few days, she devoted herself to his care, attending to his every need with unwavering dedication. As Jorge lay in bed, his thoughts kept returning to the events that had brought him to this point. Algra's words lingered in his mind, prompting him to consider what he should do next. Revenge wasn't in his nature. He wasn't the kind of man who sought to settle scores with violence or malice. But the thought of confronting the judge, of demanding to know why Silva harbored such animosity towards him, gnawed at him. What had he done to deserve this treatment? All he had done was rescue the man's daughter, yet in return, he was met with brutality and hatred. The idea of confronting Silva grew stronger with each passing day. Jorge wasn't looking for revenge, he simply wanted answers. He needed to understand why a man of the law, a judge no less, would stoop so low as to send thugs after someone who had only tried to help. What kind of twisted gratitude was this? As Jorge recovered, the resolve to speak to Silva hardened within him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had to do it for his peace of mind and the sake of his family. He couldn't let this shadow hang over them any longer. He had to confront the man who had wronged him so deeply and find out what had driven him to such lengths. Only then could Jorge truly move forward, free from the fear and anger that had plagued him since that fateful night. When Jorge finally felt strong enough to move without wincing at every step, he made a decision that had been simmering in his mind since the attack. He got into his car and drove to a place that had haunted him for years, the courthouse, where his life had been torn apart all those years ago. Pulling up to the curb, he parked and settled in for what he knew might be a long wait. His eyes scanned the throng of people coming and going, searching for the familiar figure of Martin Silva. Hours passed, the sun beginning its descent, before Jorge finally spotted the judge stepping out of the courthouse doors. Martin Silva appeared robust and cheerful, laughing with colleagues as he left, a man who seemed utterly content with his day's work. Watching him, Jorge couldn't help but wonder how many other innocent lives this man had destroyed with the same callousness he had shown Jorge all those years ago. As Silva got into his car and pulled out of the parking lot, Jorge followed at a safe distance, doing his best to remain inconspicuous. The drive led them to a quiet neighborhood where Silva parked near an apartment building. Jorge took note of the address, his resolve hardening as he watched the judge disappear into the building. He knew what he had to do: confront the man face to face. Tomorrow morning, before Silva could start his day, Jorge would be there waiting. The drive home was a blur of anxious thoughts. What could he say to a man like Martin Silva? Jorge tossed and turned that night, unable to find rest as his body still ached from the beating and his mind raced with uncertainty. The question that plagued him the most was why would Silva go to such lengths to harm him? On one hand, he felt the urge to demand answers, to finally understand the judge's twisted motivations. On the other hand, the idea of confronting the man who had orchestrated his suffering was daunting, and part of him wondered if he should abandon the plan altogether. But it was too late for that now. The thought of his family, Algra and Cesar, encountering the same thugs that had beaten him spurred him on. He couldn't let this happen again, he wouldn't let it. Jorge woke long before dawn, dressing quickly and carefully. He pulled on a medical mask to conceal the bruises that still marked his face, then threw a hood over his head. The morning was cool and quiet, the calm before the storm. As he approached Martin Silva's apartment, his mind raced with what he would say, but no clear plan came to him. He only knew that this confrontation had to happen. Parking a short distance away, Jorge confirmed that Silva's car was still there. He made his way to the building's entrance and waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't have to wait long. The door opened and Martin Silva stepped out, ready to start his day. But when he noticed the hooded figure standing by the door, the judge's confident demeanor faltered. His face drained of color as he recognized the man before him, and despite his efforts to stay composed, fear flickered in his eyes. "Señor Silva," Jorge said, stepping forward. His voice was low, but firm, each word carrying the weight of years of pain and unanswered questions. The judge froze in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The mask Jorge wore couldn't conceal the intensity of his gaze, nor the determination behind it. "We need to talk," Jorge continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. Silva's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. For the first time, the man who had wielded so much power over others now found himself at the mercy of someone he had wronged. The judge tried to maintain his composure, but the terror in his eyes was unmistakable. He had expected Jorge to fade into the background after the attack, to be too frightened to ever confront him. But here he was, standing just inches away, demanding the one thing Silva had never been willing to give an explanation. Silva took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he nodded, acknowledging that there was no avoiding this confrontation. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jorge paused, his own emotions swirling as he faced the man who had caused him so much suffering. He didn't want revenge, but he did want to understand. "I want to know why," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Why would you do this to me? Why send those men after me when all I did was save your daughter?" Silva's eyes widened in shock. It was clear he hadn't expected Jorge to know the truth, let alone confront him about it. For a moment, the judge was at a loss for words, his carefully constructed world teetering on the brink of collapse. He had spent years building his reputation, controlling every aspect of his life, but now he was faced with the one thing he couldn't control: Jorge's demand for answers. The two men stood there, the weight of their shared past hanging heavily between them. Silva knew there was no easy way out of this conversation, no way to spin the truth that would absolve him of his actions. But Jorge's gaze was unwavering, and Silva realized that, for the first time in his life, he would have to confront the consequences of his choices. As Jorge slowly removed his hood and mask, the extent of his injuries became visible, and Martin Silva's eyes widened in shock. The judge, trying to regain his composure, blustered, "And you're telling me I'm to blame for this? I never laid a finger on you." Jorge raised his hand, a simple gesture that silenced Silva. The judge noticed the melancholic look in the former convict's eyes, an expression that was more haunting than any words of anger or accusation could have been. "I didn't come here for revenge," Jorge began, his voice calm and quiet, yet filled with an undeniable weight. "I came to remind you that 15 years ago, you imprisoned me for a crime I didn't commit. You knew it, but you did it anyway. I don't blame you. You're human, and humans make mistakes. It's in our nature. Everyone has their priorities, vices, thoughts, and desires. I don't blame you for giving in to your vices, Senor Silva. I want to thank you because if it weren't for my time in prison, I wouldn't have met the love of my life. She saw in me not just a released prisoner, but me, and I love her for that." Silva listened, his bluster fading as Jorge's words sank in. The sincerity in Jorge's voice was disarming, leaving the judge with nothing to say. "I think you understand such love," Jorge continued, "when you want to shield those you care about from any danger or harm. After all, you love your wife and daughter, don't you? I love my wife and son too, and until recently I didn't care that you still held the position of judge, determining people's fates. I forgave you a long time ago, and if it weren't for your daughter, whom I found by the roadside, I wouldn't even remember you. I only regret one thing, Senor Silva, the time I lost in prison, my nerves and my health. Otherwise, I live quite happily, and I don't need you, nor vengeance on you, nor even gratitude for saving your daughter. I truly hope she grows up to be less corrupt and cowardly than you. I would like your daughter to become better and kinder." As Jorge spoke, Martin Silva felt a tremor, not from fear but from the deep realization of the cruelty he had inflicted on a man he barely knew. Tears formed in his eyes, unbidden and unexpected. Jorge paused for a moment, taking a breath before concluding, "All I want to ask of you is to forget about me and never appear in my life again." The sincerity in Jorge's voice struck Silva like a blow. Here was a man who had every reason to seek vengeance, who had suffered unjustly, and yet he stood before him, asking only to be left in peace. Silva had believed he was dealing with a vengeful criminal, but instead, he was confronted by a man of remarkable kindness and integrity, someone who had saved his daughter without expecting anything in return. The contrast between Jorge's actions and his own made Silva feel small and ashamed. "Forgive me," Martin finally breathed, a single tear escaping down his cheek. "I didn't think." Jorge shook his head gently. "There's no need for apologies. I want nothing from you. Just forget about me and live your life. I hope your daughter recovers soon. Goodbye." Without another word, Jorge turned and walked away, his steps steady despite the pain that must still have been coursing through his body. Martin Silva watched as Jorge climbed into his car and drove off. Despite knowing he should head to work, Silva remained standing in place, rooted to the spot by the weight of everything that had just transpired. Eventually, he made his way to his car, but once inside, he couldn't bring himself to start the engine. He sat behind the wheel, lost in thought, replaying Jorge's words over and over in his mind. For the first time in his long career, Silva realized he had encountered a genuinely sincere and kind person, someone who had shown him more grace than he deserved. And in that moment, Martin Silva understood that he had been allowed to change, to become better than the man he had been. But whether he would rise to that challenge was a question only time would answer. Martin Silva's life had become a blur in the days following his encounter with Jorge. His mind raced with guilt, regret, and the sharp sting of self-awareness that had struck him so unexpectedly. He spent most of his time at the hospital, visiting his daughter Mercedes, who was recovering swiftly. Each time he saw her, she grew brighter, her spirits lifting as she anticipated returning home. Yet the most difficult moments for Martin were when Mercedes spoke fondly of the stranger, the uncle who had found her by the roadside and saved her life. "He was so kind," Dad, Mercedes would say, her voice filled with warmth and gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done if he hadn't come along." Each word pierced Martin deeply. Even his daughter, so young and innocent, could see the good in the man he had wronged so profoundly. Jorge had every reason to be bitter, had chosen compassion instead, and his daughter's gratitude only deepened Martin's shame. The day finally came when Mercedes was discharged from the hospital. Martin and his wife arrived to pick her up, relieved and overjoyed to take their daughter home. As they prepared to leave, Mercedes handed her father a colorful homemade card she had drawn during her recovery. "Dad," she said, her eyes full of earnestness, "please find that man. Give him this card. I want him to know how much he's done for me." Martin's throat tightened. He forced a smile and nodded, but inside he was overwhelmed. The gesture was so simple, yet so heartfelt. He feared that if he spoke, his voice would crack, betraying the emotion that was threatening to spill over. That night, Martin couldn't sleep. The weight of his daughter's request bore down on him, and he knew what he had to do. Despite his fears and the certainty that Jorge wanted nothing more to do with him, Martin couldn't ignore his daughter's wish. She deserved that closure, and Jorge deserved her gratitude. So the next evening, Martin summoned his courage, took the card, and drove to Jorge's home. Standing in front of the apartment door, Martin hesitated, nerves fraying his composure. He adjusted his tie, his fingers trembling as he held the envelope containing the card and his business card. The door felt like a barrier, not just to Jorge's home, but to the reckoning Martin had avoided for so long. Taking a deep breath, he rang the doorbell. When Jorge opened the door, his expression immediately darkened. The smile he wore for his family vanished, replaced by a cold, guarded look. Martin stood there, visibly uneasy, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Jorge glanced back at his wife and son before stepping outside, closing the door behind him to shield his family from the tension that had suddenly filled the air. "I told you to forget about me and never show up in my life again," Jorge said, his voice quiet but firm, his eyes fixed on Martin. "I understand," Martin stammered, the words catching in his throat. He hesitated, then extended the envelope toward Jorge, his hands shaking slightly. "My daughter, Mercedes. She just got discharged. She asked about you and insisted I give you this." Jorge accepted the envelope, but his expression remained unreadable. He didn't open it, didn't glance at it. His gaze stayed locked on Martin, unmoved. "She wanted to thank you personally," Martin continued, his voice faltering under the weight of his guilt. I know I've done terrible things and I can't undo the time you lost. But inside the envelope is my business card with my number. You can call any time if you need anything." Martin stepped back, uncertain, the shame nearly overwhelming him. "Thank you, Jorge. Thank you for helping my daughter when she needed it most." With that, Martin turned away, his shoulders slumped, and disappeared down the street. Jorge stood there for a long moment, watching the man who had once condemned him, who had sent thugs to beat him, now retreating in silence. Finally, Jorge looked down at the envelope in his hands. He slowly opened it, pulling out Mercedes' card. The drawing was simple yet bright and colorful, filled with hearts and flowers, a child's way of expressing gratitude. Beneath the drawings were words written in uneven, innocent handwriting. "Thank you for saving me, Uncle. You're my hero." Jorge's heart ached as he read those words, his emotions a confusing mix of sorrow, anger, and bittersweet relief. The card was so pure, so genuine, and yet it came from a daughter whose father had caused him more pain than anyone could imagine. Behind the card was Martin Silva's business card. Jorge held it in his hand for a moment, contemplating the offer, then slid it back into the envelope. He didn't know if he would ever use it, but for now he tucked it away, walking back into the warmth of his home, where Algra and Cesar awaited him. Whatever lay ahead, Jorge knew he had found peace not in forgiveness, but in moving forward, away from the shadows of the past. Inside the envelope, Jorge found a homemade card, hand-drawn by the little girl he had saved. The picture was simple yet striking: a man standing tall with a superhero cape billowing behind him, clearly meant to represent Jorge. Beneath the drawing, in bright, colorful letters, were the words "My hero." Jorge's heart ached as he read the brief message inside, filled with gratitude and kindness. He then looked at the judge's business card with a heavy sigh. The contrast between the pure, innocent gratitude of the girl and the complicated guilt of her father was stark. Jorge returned to his home, reflecting on the irony of it all. If not Martin Silva himself, then at least his daughter was genuinely grateful for the stranger who had come to her rescue. As for Silva, it was clear that he wanted to alleviate his guilt, but Jorge wasn't sure if that was even possible. After all, time lost couldn't be recovered, a tarnished reputation couldn't be restored, and shattered dreams couldn't simply be revived. What, then, was Silva truly seeking forgiveness for? As Jorge entered his home, he saw Algra playing with Cesar, and a thought occurred to him. Perhaps it was time to tell her everything, to share the full weight of what had happened, and to seek her advice on how to navigate this complex situation. When Cesar had finally gone to bed, Jorge and Algra sat down together with cups of tea. He took a deep breath and, without holding back, began to tell her everything. He told her how he had ended up in prison all those years ago, explaining whose fault it was, and recounted the events that followed, right up to his drive home from work that fateful night. Algra listened in silence, her face a canvas of emotions, tension, gloom, and eventually horror when she heard about the girl who had been hit and whom Jorge had helped. But when Jorge revealed that the girl's father was none other than the judge who had once sentenced him, Algra gasped in shock. He continued, openly describing the beating he had endured and how her insightful remark had helped him connect the dots, realizing that the two incidents were undeniably linked. Jorge noticed genuine surprise in his wife's eyes as he recounted how he had tracked down the judge. But as he told her about their final conversation, he could see that Algra never suspected him of planning anything cruel toward Martin Silva. "You never cease to amaze me with your kindness," darling Algra said softly, her voice filled with admiration. "Even after everything that man did to you, you still acted honorably." "That's just who I am." Algra Jorge or he, Jorge replied with a sigh. "We can't change the past, and honestly, without what happened 15 years ago, I wouldn't have met you," he smiled, reaching for her hand. She squeezed his hand in return, and Jorge continued his story, concluding by placing the postcard on the table, the one delivered by Martin Silva earlier that evening. Algra sat quietly for a long time, her eyes focused on the drawing and the signature. Jorge could tell from her expression that she was deep in thought, carefully considering everything he had told her. Finally, she sighed and straightened her shoulders, adopting a serious and determined demeanor, one that reminded Jorge of the strong, self-assured woman he had fallen in love with, someone who would go to any lengths to support him. "You know what, dear," Algra said, her voice steady. "The fact that the girl wanted to thank you in person speaks volumes about her character. She's a much better person than her father. And the fact that Martin personally delivered this message to you shows that he's realized how despicable his actions were. You've been offered an olive branch, and I think you should accept it. Tomorrow, I want you to call that judge and arrange a meeting. And if you need me, I'll be there with you to support you." Jorge felt a surge of gratitude as he hugged his wife tightly. He was deeply thankful to have found such an incredible woman, someone who understood him, who loved him unconditionally, and who always knew how to guide him through life's toughest challenges. Fate had indeed arranged his life in a way that felt almost miraculous. Algra had saved him, just like an angel sent from above, and she continued to stand by his side, even when he hadn't shared every detail of what had happened. Her love for him was something he hadn't even dared to dream of, and it gave him the strength to face whatever came next. With Algra's support, Jorge knew that he could navigate this difficult situation with dignity. Whatever happened next, he would be ready to face it, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of a need for closure for himself, for his family, and perhaps, in some small way, even for Martin Silva. The next morning, under Algra's watchful and supportive gaze, Jorge made the call to Martin Silva. The judge's voice on the other end was surprisingly warm, and he suggested a meeting to celebrate his daughter Mercedes' discharge from the hospital. Jorge could hear the excitement in Mercedes' voice as she expressed her eagerness to meet the man who had saved her life. In the end, they decided to meet as families, a decision that Jorge felt was the best possible outcome. Having the children around would help ease the tension between the adults and create a more relaxed atmosphere. Jorge realized that meeting Mercedes again was something he needed as well. He had been deeply concerned for her well-being ever since he took her to the hospital. To Jorge and Algra's surprise, Martin invited them to his home, a gesture that carried significant meaning. It was as if the judge wanted to put himself in a vulnerable position, much like Jorge had been when he opened his door to find Martin standing there with a postcard in hand. Jorge also understood that there were practical reasons for this decision. Mercedes, though discharged, was still wearing casts on her arm and leg, and being at home would be far more comfortable for her than navigating a public space like a restaurant. Moreover, the conversations that were likely to unfold between the families might have been too personal for a public setting. When Jorge, Algra, and Cesar arrived at the Silva residence, Jorge's initial nervousness and lingering shame began to dissipate. The warmth of Martin's wife, Anna, and the bright, cheerful spirit of Mercedes helped to lighten the atmosphere. That evening, the focus was on expressing gratitude to Jorge for saving Mercedes. Toasts were raised in his honor, and Jorge, though feeling a bit awkward, couldn't help but smile at the sincerity of the gratitude he received from Anna, Martin, and especially Mercedes. It was clear that their family was deeply relieved and grateful that Jorge had not turned a blind eye to their daughter's plight. The dinner was filled with light and easy conversation. The women bonded over discussions about dresses and upcoming exhibitions, while the children quickly found common ground and played together. Meanwhile, Jorge and Martin gradually got to know each other better. The tension that had once existed between them began to melt away, replaced by a tentative understanding. After dinner, Martin suggested they step into his office for a private conversation. "Let's talk alone," he said, nodding toward the door. "I have something I'd like to give you." Jorge agreed, following Martin into the office. On the judge's desk, Jorge noticed a thick folder with an envelope placed neatly on top. "I know the past can't be undone," Martin began, his voice heavy with the weight of his words as he touched the folder and envelope. "But I've done what I can. Inside this folder is a document signed by me, acknowledging that my decision in your case was wrong. I've also included some evidence of your innocence that was overlooked back then. I know my actions were unforgivable. And I understand how badly I messed up. Your words the other day made me truly reflect on how many lives I've ruined in my pursuit of. I don't even know what anymore." Jorge looked at the folder, his emotions a mix of surprise, relief, and something that felt almost like closure. "Repentance is a heavy burden," he said grimly. "Sometimes it can break a person." Martin nodded, his expression somber. "Your forgiveness and the things you said to me won't go in vain. I promise you that. I've come to a serious decision. I have no right to continue in a position where I decide the fates of others. I'm resigning." Jorge was taken aback. He hadn't expected this. He studied Martin, searching for any sign of insincerity, but all he saw was a man who had been deeply shaken and was now trying to make amends in the only way he knew how. "That's a big decision," Jorge finally said, his voice softer now, less guarded. "It is," Martin agreed, "but it's the right one. I can't continue in my role knowing the damage I've done. I need to step back, reflect, and find a way to live with the choices I've made." Jorge took a deep breath, absorbing the weight of Martin's words. He knew that this decision wouldn't erase the past, but it was a step toward healing for both of them. The document in the folder wouldn't give him back the years he lost, but it was a tangible acknowledgement of the wrongs that had been done to him, something he had never expected to receive. "Thank you," Jorge said quietly, finally allowing himself to accept the olive branch that had been extended. "I don't know what the future holds, but I hope you find peace in whatever you decide to do next." Martin nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "I hope so too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And I hope that this is a step toward making things right, even if it's only a small one." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past hanging between them. Then, with a small but genuine smile, Jorge extended his hand. Martin hesitated only for a moment before taking it, the handshake a symbol of the fragile but real understanding that had begun to form between them. As Jorge left the office and rejoined his family, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that he could finally move forward, leaving the bitterness of the past behind. And with Algra and Cesar by his side, he knew that he was no longer alone in facing whatever challenges life would bring. Jorge stared at the envelope in his hands, skepticism etched on his face. "And what will these papers give me? Time can't be brought back." Martin Silva sighed, the weight of his guilt evident in his voice. "These papers will allow you to clear your record. Maybe it won't give you back what I took away. But you'll no longer be labeled a former convict or prisoner. You'll be recognized as wrongfully convicted. That means the opportunities that were once out of reach because of your conviction will now be available to you." Jorge remained silent, still finding it hard to believe that anything could truly undo the damage of the past. Yet, a week later, when he returned to work, the reality of those words began to unfold unexpectedly. During a break, his boss approached him with an air of importance. The factory had received updated documents indicating that Jorge was not only innocent but had been recognized for his heroism in saving a child. The management, impressed by his hard work and character, had concluded that there was no better candidate for a promotion than Jorge. His boss explained that while Jorge had always been valued for his diligence and problem-solving abilities, often addressing issues independently to avoid burdening the management, his conviction had previously stood in the way of any advancement. The concern had been that promoting someone with a criminal record might tarnish the factory's reputation. However, with his conviction overturned and his name cleared, Jorge was now seen in a completely new light. He was the ideal candidate for the position of workshop manager, a role that had been vacant since the previous manager's retirement. Jorge was stunned. All his life, he had believed in the power of hard work and kindness, but now he saw how those values were finally paying off in ways he hadn't dared to imagine. All he had done was stop to help an injured girl on the side of the road, and now, not only was his past being rewritten, but his future was opening up in ways he had once thought impossible. As for Martin Silva, the man who had once ruined his life, he had indeed retired from his position as a judge. But guilt continued to drive him. Using his own money, Silva opened a small legal office dedicated to helping those who had been wrongfully convicted, much like Jorge. He hired skilled lawyers who were passionate about seeking justice for the innocent. It was a small step, perhaps not enough to fully atone for his past, but it was an effort to make amends, to use his knowledge and resources for good. Mercedes, now fully recovered, played a significant role in this new chapter of her father's life. Her daily example of kindness and her gratitude toward Jorge enforced the lesson Silva was learning, that being kind leads to true happiness. The bond between father and daughter grew stronger as they worked together to right the wrongs that had been done, both in their own lives and in the lives of others. As we come to the end of this powerful story, we want to take a moment to reflect on the journey we've just witnessed. What have you learned from Jorge's resilience, Martin's path to redemption, and the impact of kindness and forgiveness? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please share in the comments below one lesson you've learned from this story and how you plan to bring it into your own life. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing stories that inspire and uplift. Thank you for watching.